this question, if I want to hear, I wrote a column recently actually about kind of a lot of the subjects that we were talking about, just, and the premise was whether social media was destroying the news. I'd say maybe half the responses were people saying, yes, I agree with you, you made some really good points, and I think the other half was, you know, what's destroying the news is the fact that you have a bias. That's what's destroying the news. And that's a really complicated question and a really complicated accusation. For starters, I think the mainstream media has been accused of being biased or having an agenda in some way or another for, I mean, years. I mean, going all the way back to Nixon and what he said about his adversarial relationship with the press. But it goes, again, you have to, first of all, let me start with this. The whole notion of objectivity in journalism is a relatively recent phenomenon in journalism. Back in the 1920s in America, during what we might call the yellow journalism era, even as recently as World War II, war correspondents that would follow, say, American troops in the war, if you read accounts of that, they were very sanitized. They did not necessarily depict reality on the ground the way that we might see reporting, the way we saw it in Vietnam, or the way we saw it, the way we see it now in Syria, or the way we see it in more recent times. A lot of the American war correspondents that were following the war were very much cheerleaders. They were only exposed to the American side, and so they were telling things from a distinctly American perspective. And again, going back to even further to the 1920s, I mean, there was an explosion in the number of newspapers because, yes, you had to have a printing press, but it was still relatively cheap to be able to print something quickly and disseminate it. And so there were people who had, I mean, newspapers were aggressively, they had a certain agenda. And the publisher of the New York Times at the time was sort of a rebel in the sense that he said, you know what, we're not going to take a conservative or a liberal or whatever perspective. Like, we're going to try to incorporate as many points of view into our newspaper as possible because, I mean, it was for selfish reasons, it was actually quite simple. His idea was, well, if I incorporate more perspectives and tell things in a more balanced way, I'm just going to have more people reading me, and I'm going to be able to destroy all these other people who only curtail their coverage to a very specific area. So, you know, take that all the way through the 1930s, the 1940s, the 1950s, and now you start getting this idea, again, only relatively recently, of this idea of objectivity, that reporters are supposed to go in, or journalists are supposed to go into a situation and tell the news dispassionately. Wire services, you know, the Associated Press, many of you probably heard of it, this idea that things were told in this dispassionate narrative, just the facts, like most important stuff at the top, least important stuff at the bottom. But even that act of deciding this is the most important stuff at the top, like there's a human being who's deciding this is the most important thing at the top and this is the least important thing, and you, through your life experience, may decide, well, actually, the thing that's in the 6th paragraph strikes me as way more important than the thing that's at the top of the story. And so, first of all, the idea of objective journalism and reporters being objective it's impossible. It cannot be done. We are shaped by experiences, we are shaped by our lives, we are shaped by who we come in contact, what we've done, who we've seen, who we've met, and everything. What we try to do in being objective is we try to apply an objective set or way that we go about seeking the truth. And the truth is the closest version that we can possibly get to at the given time of publication. Now you have what I would argue is a pretty nice luxury in this environment, which is you do have the ability to step back, breathe, see the forest in the trees, and be able to write something, yes, more analytical, but not in this day-to-day, like, okay, like, what's the latest Trump news? No, like, really take a step back. And that's hugely valuable in a world where it just seems like we're just bombarded with news and information. But again, going back to objectivity, it's the ability to be able to approach the reporting of a story in an objective manner. Yes, I talk to both sides, or multiple sides, or 3 sides, or 4 sides, or 5 sides of the story. I try and talk to as many people as possible. I don't leave out a source. But even then, even the organization of those facts is itself a subjective exercise. Like, I have to exercise editorial judgment. I used this example earlier today, but you don't want to go and watch 4.5 hours of a live stream of Denver City Council. Like, you don't have time for that. You are relying on a journalist to take the most essential pieces of that meeting, distill them into some kind of narrative and say, okay, this is the most important thing. They voted to allow pot shops in Denver to stay open until 10 p.m. instead of 7 p.m. I'd argue that that is the biggest news to come out of that, that council meeting a few weeks ago. They may have done some other stuff, but we're objectively saying this is the most important thing, so this is what it is. But there's always going to be something where we're making decisions about what we can and can't include.
But I mean, I think that's right. I would just say let's continue on this, and I'd be interested also in your opinion about the objectivity of the news and the objectivity, especially of the reporter. But I think, let's take FBI Director Comey, right? We just had a huge story break, right, that he got fired. And everybody's wondering now more and more exactly why he was fired. But what was striking, and something you brought up earlier today, is that he was kind of the darling child of the right for a little while, right, with all the investigative work he was doing on Hillary Clinton, but then he gets fired by Trump. And so you have this strange situation in which if you were to read the opinion section of the Wall Street Journal and the opinion section of New York Times, you find the opposite of what you would have expected 2 months ago, which is that the New York Times says, oh my gosh, I can't believe they fired him. It was totally unexpected, it shouldn't have happened, right? Versus the Journal, which instead says, oh no, this guy had to go. So, I mean, the question, it kind of reminds me, of like growing up as a little kid and having a sister who I fought like crazy with. And of course, I came to my mom, and the way that I had the facts laid out was totally right for me, right? But obviously that benefited my position, right? Versus my sister told this, and then it's my mom's job to figure it out. And it's kind of like, okay, we feel like the parents, at least I do, reading the news stories and thinking, why should I have to decide who's right here? Isn't that your guys' job? I mean, is there something, how do we solve this problem?
I think part of, I'll just briefly say, I think part of the issue with this particular story is that there's still so much that is not known, and when you have a situation where there's a lot of information that is not known, okay, well, what were the real motivations? When Trump goes on television and says something like, I would have fired him regardless of what my deputy AG said, and the original press statement said, he and all of his surrogates said, I fired him because of, on the recommendation of the Deputy Attorney General. Now you invite all this speculation. I think the most benign, again, depending on your perspective, the most benign interpretation of that is just a press shop and a communication strategy that is just utterly disorganized and chaotic. Often very much in the vein of just the way the campaign went. The more cynical side is that, well, he did it because he wanted to, depending on what you're reading, like he did it because he wanted to stop or railroad the investigation into Russia. So again, I think like the variety of interpretations of this right now are precisely because there's just so much we don't know at this point.
I see where you're going, but what I want to do here, what I'm trying to understand is, okay, but sometimes it appears as if we absolutely know there's bias. I agree with you. Objectivity is impossible, it seems like in journalism. But you have the Times, who is clearly giving its take, and obviously this is opinion, so that's what we expect, and the Journal who does its take, but it's switched because it's in their best interest. I mean, can we avoid this? What would it look like to report properly? I mean, what I'm trying to say is objectivity a real thing? Is it possible? Do we want it? I don't know.
I would say in the comment section, in the opinion section, I mean, I think different rules play in the sense of, I go back to Cicero again, the opinion section pertains to the world of move as opposed to teach or to delight. So this is clearly that there is a specific text with a specific context with a specific goal. And I think it's fair. I would be more, like to me, the image of this whole mess with the director of FBI is Stephen Colbert. I'm not sure, I don't know if you saw it. He recorded this show 10 minutes after the news broke. And he announced that to the public is clearly like on the liberal side, like admittedly is not, and you can assume that the public that goes live to his show, live, I mean, actually recording, but people that are in the studio with him are like-minded mostly. Is that
He's recording it in New York City, after all.
Right. And he announced that, but he was like, he broke literally 10 minutes before, and he announced that, saying like, Trump just fired James Comey, and the people in the studio cheered like crazy, and they clapped their hands, and he had to step back and sort of lecture them, like, no, this is not a good thing. Like, guys, you used to be our enemy, but now he's our friend. This is not. I'm not taking. It's not to illustrate a position that I want to take on this. It is to illustrate the amount of confusion that the people has. Now, my responsibility is not firing or hiring any FBI director, because I'm not the president. My responsibility, though, is educating in the same way, take it in the right context, educating the people to try to understand a reality that is extremely complex, like this, what Dan said, illustrating all the implication and the unknowns that are there is crazy. But I think there was and there is a responsibility, for example, in loading and charging with political meaning everything, to the point that in a climate like this, politically and from the standpoint of the news, so overheated.
Hysteria.
Yeah, it becomes impossible. So I'm going back to my point. It's when these people collapse, indirectly, but not so much, it's a failure of me in reporting what has been, like, even in leading people to understand that things are complicated, or even sometimes, which I think is something that we don't do ever, like leading readers to understand that there are unknowns, which is a piece of news, an unknown in a way, because if I'm telling you I have these 3 factors, but I suspect that there are other 10 factors that I can't put my finger on, it is my duty to tell you, like, hey, these are the 10 factors. We are in the process to sort of like understanding. But these whole things is playing, we don't know yet. But we have to take into account that there is another side of the story that is now in the dark. But we are exactly in the process of discovering. I think that's our responsible. I think Comey's story, it was so loaded, and it is so loaded, that at some point it was loaded on one side, and the other point it was loaded on the other side politically, to the point of being like super paradoxical. This paradox, it didn't exist in nature. We didn't create it, meaning in the sense of the real fake news. We didn't create a story like Comey is lefty or Comey is a conservative. No, we didn't create that, but we did create the hysterical narrative around it. We shined the light in a way that ultimately was confusing for the people that were clapping their hands, not understanding that it was not their hero anymore. So like, and it was a painful moment for me from the perspective of someone that for a living tells stories.
And again, this is opinion journalism, so you're if you're talking about the op-eds between the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, more conservative leaning, tends to be hawkish on things like war. The New York Times more reflective of the city that it lives in, left leaning. You can read both of those editorials and I think grasp like nuggets of truth in both. That yes, like absolutely, 6 months ago that people on the left were furious about the way that then Director Comey handled the Clinton investigation, and the Journal basically saying like, he had this coming, it was a long time coming. Even conceded like, okay, the timing maybe wasn't the best. He probably should have done it sooner. And of course, the Times saying, this is just an absolute breach of potential obstruction of justice, et cetera, et cetera. Again, one of the real complicated things just in the world we live in is if you, I'll go back to the social media thing, you dive into your feed and depending on, I just can't overstate how much that shapes the way that we view the world and view the news, and that's all driven by an algorithm. This idea, and maybe we're getting a little away from what you're talking about, but it's driven by an algorithm. So instead of editors saying this is what we think is the most important, you're being rewarded with stuff that you have previously liked, people that you've previously engaged with, previously commented on. So again, going back to filter bubbles, like you could totally dive into your Facebook feed, and if you're somebody who leans more to the left, you could think the world is ending and like everything's coming crashing down. There's actually a really excellent, I encourage you all to go look at it. It's called Red Feed, Blue Feed. It was something put out by the Wall Street Journal during the election. And you can just see sort of more left-leaning sources on one side and more right-leaning sources on the other side, and just the way that they're interpreting the events of this world. And I think, again, it's illustrative of the fact that we're just increasingly dividing ourselves into these bubbles. Again, not just digitally and in sort of our reality that is the digital world, but also in the world of just physically, too. I mean, cities are burgeoning with people and population. Cities in this country tend to be more dynamic, urban, liberal places. They, for the most part, vote blue versus the vast swath of red in the rest of the middle of this country. And increasingly, again, I think you can go to these things and realize, like, I could look at my Facebook feed and see one thing. I could go to somebody else living in West Virginia and see a totally different reality of what the world is. But we're spending and I'm going to call Facebook out here specifically, and actually they're coming into town in a couple days to meet with a bunch of publishers in Denver. They exercise an unbelievable amount of control over the way that we see the world in a way that we've just never seen before. And I think it's incumbent upon all of us as news consumers and journalists to understand, like, just what those things are doing to us. And again, purposely seeping out. Like, after the Comey thing, like the day that it happened, like, I went to the Times editorial page and read their take, and I went to the Journal editorial page because I knew I'd see totally different perspectives on the same event. And again, sometimes you could read other things and see totally different interpretations. But I guess what I'd say is, like, as an antidote to all this, the truth is complicated, the truth is hard, the truth is difficult to get at sometimes, and especially in an event like this that's moving so quickly and changing so quickly, it can seem absolutely impossible to be able to keep up with it. And so I don't know if I necessarily have a good answer for that, other than just observing the fact that it's happening.
Sorry, Tim, allow me to react to what Dan was saying, that I think is very interesting when you talk about the algorithm and then all the filter bubble, all the process of selection. But I think that there's a very interesting thing that is happening there, which is we tend, I think I do, and yeah, I think generally we tend to think that the algorithm, whatever is the tool that we use to select or shape our feeds, is sort of an impersonal tool, because it's ultimately a mathematical tool that is used according to your information. But at the same time, is very, very personal because it's tailored on you. It's an algorithm, so a mathematical tool, but it's based on your preferences. So the way you represent yourself in the social media world. So in a way, it's not. I see, in a way, you could interpret that as like a takeover of technology. What traditionally media did, that technology is doing. At the same time, is a takeover of our egos. It's a takeover of our own personalities. A takeover of self-referentiality as the ultimate criterion through which I see the world. Whereas I see, like in the mission of journalism, in a way, exactly the opposite movement is taking you out of yourself. Because exactly, I'm here to show you what, as you said before, what you don't know, but also what you don't know that you don't know. It's like I'm taking you out of your comfort zone. I'm taking you in places you would never go because life is limited. Your ability to know is limited. And so, but I'm telling you, hey, I got a flag here because this is important. Why is important? Because I tell you. Why is important that I tell you? Because it's all the process of building trust and authority. But I think algorithm, in a way, paradoxically symbolize not so much the impersonality of technology, but sort of the dictatorship of ego. If you allow me to use this hyperbolic expression.
You can trademark that too. No, I
That's
think
too much.
no, but I think, but